Hello and welcome to the fifth lesson in social influence, although this is slightly out of order because you will see on this slide that actually this is specification 6, situational variables affecting obedience, including proximity, location and uniform as investigated by Milgram. So we'll cover specification 5 in the next lesson. So this is a bit of a change what we've done so far, because so far we have looked at what conformity is, types and explanations. We've looked at conformity to social roles. And now we're looking at obedience, which is different to conformity. So it's very important that you separate out conformity and obedience and make sure that when you're talking about Milgram's variations that you refer to obedience. So we're going to outline Milgram's original baseline experiment, and then we're going to look at those 3 situational variables that have been identified in the specification. So these were variables that we will compare to the original baseline study. So obedience is different to conformity because it's still a form of social influence, but it's one in which a person will yield to explicit instructions or orders from an authority figure, and which they generally would not have done without the instruction. So I've asked you here to state the difference between obedience and conformity. So pause the video and just make sure that you can identify the difference. So hopefully you've identified that conformity is conformity to the majority. It's to do with peer pressure. It's where you fit in with the people around you, but nobody is telling you what to do. It's a form of social influence where you are influenced by the pressure you feel from the majority. Whereas obedience is where somebody tells you to do something that you wouldn't ordinarily do, and then you yield to that. So you give in to that instruction. So if you obey, somebody tells you what to do and you do it. If you conform, nobody tells you what to do, but you feel the pressure from what everybody else is doing. I recommend you go on Moodle and just have a quick look at this 10-minute video. It shows part of a TV program by Derren Brown. Now, he is not a psychologist, he's a TV presenter, but he uses a lot of psychology. And in this particular 10-minute slot, he's talking to a bunch of business executives, and they don't know, they know that they've applied to be on a TV program, but they don't know that it's this one. And he gives them a direct order that they need to go to the local shop and steal from it, which of course is a criminal activity. And it's just really interesting to watch the video, because these people are ordinary people who would never normally steal from a shop, and yet because they have been given a direct instruction by somebody in authority, so Derren Brown is a famous TV personality, because they've been given an instruction, they obey and they go and break the law, which is definitely something they wouldn't usually do. So when it comes to the exam, you don't need to mention anything about Derren Brown, please don't. What you need to do is explain Milgram's baseline experiment on obedience. And I will, if you're watching this on MS Teams, have a look, pause the video here, have a look in the description, and I will have put 2 different videos on. One's only 3 minutes and one is 12 minutes, and it shows you Milgram's baseline experiment, and it's really important that you watch it so you can get a feel for it rather than me just explain it. Watch the video clips. The first video clip is original footage from a 1963 experiment that Milgram did, so you can see a real participant. The second one is it was a replication of the experiment in 2006, so it's much better video quality, but it's exactly the same experiment. So pause it here, come back, and welcome back. After watching those video clips, what you will have seen is that baseline study. So Milgram used a volunteer sample by putting an advert in a newspaper to recruit participants to come to an experiment at Yale University where he worked. But the advert involved deception, because it said that people would take part in an experiment to look at how punishment affects learning, and that was a lie. The real purpose of the experiment was to test obedience to legitimate authority. So in the real study, people went along and they were deceived in many ways. They thought that they were given the role of teacher in an experiment with a teacher and a learner. And if you look at that picture there, you can see L, T, and E. So L is the learner and E is the experimenter. And those people are confederates. They are just actors. They are acting as a learner and acting as an experimenter who's in charge. T stands for teacher, and the real participant was tricked into thinking that they had been randomly assigned the role of teacher. And then they were given an electric shock generator, which you would have seen in the video clip. And they were told to do a task where they had to give the learner who's in the next room word pairs, and then the learner had to remember certain things and answer. But now, because the learner was a confederate, they on purpose got a lot of questions wrong, and every time they got a question wrong, the teacher was required by the experimenter to give the learner an electric shock. And it started at 15 volts and it went all the way up in 15-volt intervals to 450 volts. And so 15 volts would be a mild shock, 450 volts would kill somebody. As you would have seen on the video, the electricity supply in the UK is 240 volts, and if you stuck your finger in a plug socket, which you should never do, you would get a severe electric shock. And just in case people didn't know anything about voltage, on the shock generator it had words written on it like danger, severe shock, XXX, danger to life, and so people would be aware that they were administering extremely high electric shocks. So this was the setup of the experiment, and what they wanted to, the aim of the investigation was to find out whether the teacher would keep electrocuting the learner just because somebody in authority was telling them to do it. At 300 volts, the learner would start screaming their head off and asking to be let out, and at some point they would then go silent as if they'd passed out or died. And Milgram and his researchers wanted to find out whether the participants would keep obeying instructions from the legitimate authority figure. So this is just, you will have already seen these videos. So the top video, there's that picture there, the top picture is the real footage of the real experiment, and then the bottom one was the replication. And the percentage, Milgram and his research assistants, they kind of speculated how many people they thought would carry on electrocuting people, and they thought it'd be like 0.001%. You know, they just didn't really think anybody would, but they were wrong. So the findings were that 65% of people obeyed to the maximum voltage of 450 volts. So there were 40 men, 40 white middle-aged men in the experiment. 65% of those went all the way to 450 volts. So you might want to pause it here and work out how many people that would be. Good luck. And another finding was that all the participants went to 300 volts. So 100% of people went to 300, 65% of people went to 450. So these are the actual results. You can see there that it was only when it got to 300 volts that anybody stopped. So I'd like you to draw a bar chart, pause the video and draw a bar chart to represent this data. Make sure you label the axes and give your graph a title, and the reason I'm asking you to do this is to do exam practice, because you could get asked to draw a graph in the exam, and also just to get you to focus in on the actual findings that 100% of people went to 300 volts and 65% of people went to 450, and you can see there that represents as 26 people. So your graph should look like this: a bar chart to show the voltage that participants stopped the experiment is your title, and on the y-axis you should have percentage and number of people, and on the x-axis are the different voltages. So well done. Bit of research methods practice. Identify the sampling method used by Milgram, describe the sample, and what was the experimental method. So pause the video and answer those questions. And the sampling method, as I said, was a volunteer sample because they put an advert in a newspaper. The sample itself was 40 middle-aged men, and that's important because you can criticise that later for a lack of population validity. And the experimental method was a laboratory experiment because it was done in an artificial room in Yale University. So it was a highly controlled laboratory experiment. So that was the baseline study, procedure and findings. And in the spec it says Milgram's variations, situational factors in obedience. And it asks you, although there were 18 variations, it wants you to know about the proximity, location and uniform. You're also going to find out about the presence of allies because that's important for another lesson further down. So I'm going to explain them to you, but you can also just download handout SPO2 and read about them and skip this bit of the video. If you'd rather just read about it, go and have a look on the SPO2 handout. Otherwise, I'll explain it now. So the first one is proximity, and proximity means how close you are together. And so Milgram changed the situation so that instead of in the baseline experiment, which you can see there, the learner and teacher were in separate rooms, and we saw obedience was 65%, he changed it so that the learner and the teacher were put in the same room, and they found obedience fell. So when you increase the proximity of the learner to the teacher was less likely to obey. Only 40% of people obeyed, and it was because they could see the pain that they were causing. So obedience is more likely to occur if you have greater proximity. If you're asked to do something you don't want to do, but you're quite far away from the actual person that you're hurting, then you're more likely to obey. If you bring the proximity if you reduce the proximity of the learner and the teacher, it drops to 40%. There's another proximity study, and it was called hand forced on shock plates. You've got the original study there, 65% obedience. And when they changed it so that the learner refused to answer questions, and if they did that, the teacher had to force the hand of the learner onto the shock plate, like in that picture there, they found that obedience dropped to 30%. So the more that you reduce the proximity between yourself and the person that's being hurt, the less likely you are to obey, that we can see from this. So, and then remember, the learner wasn't really being shocked, but they were acting as though they were being shocked and were like screaming their head off, and so the teacher would have felt even more guilty. There is another proximity variation where the experimenter gave instructions over the phone. So in the original experiment, the experimenter was in the room, as you can see there, and obedience was 65%. In this variation, the experimenter gave instructions to the teacher over the phone, and you can see that obedience plummeted to 21%. And they found that the teachers were lying to the experimenters, going, "Yes, I've administered the shock," when really they hadn't. So this is saying if you increase the proximity of the legitimate authority, if you decrease the proximity of the legitimate authority figure, people are less likely to obey. So the further away the legitimate authority figure is to you, you don't feel as much pressure to obey them. And that's because you can lie and go, "Yep, I've done that, no problem." So you don't feel as much social pressure to obey. Milgram did a variation where he changed the location. So the original location is Yale University, which you can see in that picture down, and we know that baseline obedience was 65%. When they changed the location to a rundown office in Connecticut, obedience dropped to 48%. Now that figure on the screen is incorrect. It's not 40%, it's 48%. Could you make sure that you make a note? So this variation showed us that the institution itself can act as a legitimate authority figure. So Yale University is a bit like Oxford or Cambridge University. It's well respected, and it carries this kind of weight of authority around it because it is such a prestigious place. Whereas a rundown office isn't as prestigious, and people didn't feel the pressure to obey quite so much, and so obedience dropped to 48%. Another variation was to do with the power of uniform, and so in the original experiment, the experimenter wore a lab coat as a kind of uniform to show that they were the legitimate authority figure. Really, they were just an actor. and we know that obedience was 65%. But when in one variation the experimenter was called away and another member of the public was like another person who was meant to be a participant was asked to act as the experimenter who wasn't wearing a lab coat, they were wearing their ordinary clothes, and obedience dropped to 20%. So this variation shows us that uniform is incredibly powerful when it comes to obedience. If someone's in uniform, like a police officer, for example, then you're far more likely to obey than if somebody's just in their regular clothes. And the last variable that we'll look at, the last variation, included the role of social support, and it's called the Two Rebels study. So there's the original experiment, one teacher, the learner and the experimenter, and of course we know it is 65% obedience. But when they changed it to the real participant had two peers or two rebels sitting either side of them, and the rebels were rebellious because they would say to the experimenter, well, I'm not going to electrocute the learner. And so we saw obedience fall to the most amount in this variation. It dropped to 10%. And it's because if you're in a situation where someone's giving you instructions and you don't want to obey, then you're going to feel far more comfortable disobeying if other people around you are also disobeying. So if you've got someone on your side who's saying, no, I'm not doing it, then that will give you the psychological power to go, well, I'm not doing it either. And so this is a really important variation, which we will look at in a couple of lessons' time when we look at resistance to social influence. So there are some of the findings of the situational variables. Use SPO2 handout to write a directional hypothesis for each of the variations, and I've given you the IV and DV on the SPO2 for each of the variations, and on the last page it asks you to draw a bar chart to show the findings of the variations. So we're going to look at the evaluation of the original theory we're going to look at the evaluation of Milgram's research. And Milgram is named in the specification, so you must know his name. And so the first piece of research is going to support Milgram's variation on the power of a uniform, and you should already be aware of this study because it was in the video you did for your enrolment homework. So this research was done by an experimenter called Bushman, and they asked a female research assistant to dress up in 3 different ways. They would either dress up as a police officer, a business executive, and a beggar. And it was the same person. Now, obviously, in that slide there with the people, I've just got those images from Google Images, so which I'm sure I've referenced, and they're different people. But in the Bushman experiment, it was the same person dressed up in 3 different ways. And the thing they were asked to do was to go up to somebody in the street and say, I've run out of money for my parking meter, give me 10p for the parking meter. So it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was telling someone to give them money. And they wanted to see if there was going to be a difference in how much people obeyed depending on the uniform. And there was a difference. So the highest amount of obedience at 72% was for the police officer, 48% obeyed the business exec, and 52% the beggar. And so this is research to support the idea that uniform is a powerful component when it comes to obedience. We are more likely to obey the commands of somebody who is in a uniform than other people. Could you do a bit of research methods practice before we move on to the other evaluation points? So if you pause the video and answer those questions. And hopefully you've identified that the experimental method for Bushman was a field experiment. The IV was the different uniforms and the DV was whether they gave money. So a non-directional hypothesis will be there will be a difference in whether people give money to a research assistant depending on if they're dressed as a police officer, a beggar, or a business executive. The sampling method, how did they get their participants? It was done through opportunity sampling because they just went to whoever was available on the day. And one ethical issue with Bushman's experiment was that there was no informed consent. People didn't know that they were taking part in the experiment, so there was no right to withdraw, no informed consent, and they were deceived as well because they weren't the person was dressing up as different people. They weren't actually those people. Okay, so another evaluation point for Milgram, and a biggie, is the ethical implications, the ethical issues. So first of all, pause the video and remind yourself, write down what are the 6 BPS guidelines for ethical research. And you should have identified the PRICL, so protection from psychological and physical harm, right to withdraw, informed consent, confidentiality, lack of deception, and privacy. So Milgram was highly criticised for doing the experiment, and Baumrind in 1964 identified that there was deception that led to lack of informed consent. So first of all, pause the video and write down all the ways that the naive participant was deceived. And hopefully you've identified they were deceived about what the research was actually about. So they thought the research was on how punishment affects learning, but it was really on obedience to legitimate authority. If you don't take any other notes, write that down. The participants thought the experiment was on how punishment affects learning, but it was really on obedience to legitimate authority. So that was the first deception point. They were deceived into thinking they had been randomly allocated the role of teacher. They were deceived into thinking the learner and the experimenter were real people when actually they were Confederates. And they were deceived into thinking the shocks were real. So they were also deceived into thinking that they were damaging the health and possibly killing somebody in the other room. All of those things led to a lack of informed consent. The most important one was that first one. And if you only remember that, put that one down. People didn't sign up to take part in an experiment on obedience to legitimate authority. They actually signed up for an experiment on punishment on learning. So that is one of the ethical issues. Another ethical issue is the right to withdraw. So what was it about Milgram's study that left people uncertain about whether they could withdraw from the experiment? What do you think? Pause it and have a think. And it's the verbal prods by the experimenter. So if you remember when you watched the video footage, every time the teacher tried to say, I don't want to do this, the experimenter would give a verbal prod and say, the experiment requires that you continue. It's important that you continue. You must continue. And so people didn't know they had the right to withdraw. Another ethical issue is the protection from psychological harm. So before I get into this first point, you could just say that people left the experiment thinking that they were capable of killing someone, which would have really damaged people psychologically. And Darley acknowledged that for some people who took part in the experiment, it might actually have triggered them to become more violent in their everyday life. And so by taking part in the experiment, it might have awakened some kind of dormant aspect of their personality that allowed them to be motivated to be more violent in their real life. So the experiment could act as a trigger for violent acts. And Lifton found in 1986, he reported that the physicians in the Nazi death camps started out as ordinary people but became killing machines. And so their personalities had altered as a consequence of the activities they were asked to perform. Now, it's a bit of a leap to say that people who took part in Milgram's experiment become as awful as the physicians in the Nazi death camps. But it has been acknowledged by psychologists that taking part could have triggered them to become more violent themselves. So there's a bit of a memory peg for you. I always think of a gun with Darley written across it. And then I remember that I look at the gun and think, what am I looking at that for? And I think, oh yeah, it acts as a trigger. The Milgram experiment acts as a trigger for violent acts. Another evaluation point is a lack of realism in the experiment. And sorry, it says AO2 there. It should say AO3 for evaluation. So Orne and Holland in 1968 said that the certain part of the experiment would have been unbelievable. So which part of the experiment do you think people might have thought nah, I'm not buying this. I don't believe that's true. What do you reckon? And hopefully you've thought about the electric shocks themselves. And so Orne and Holland believed that people wouldn't have believed that the electric shocks were real, and therefore they would have just been displaying demand characteristics. And if you look at that picture there is of when the teacher was asked to force the learner's hand onto the shock plate. Because if you force someone's hand onto a shock plate and they get an electric shock, then you will get an electric shock as well because you're touching them. And so that particular aspect might have shown people the real experiment, that the shocks weren't real, and therefore they were just displaying demand characteristics. So that impacts on the internal validity, because although the experiment was well controlled, it wasn't necessarily well designed, because people would have guessed that element of the experiment wasn't true. Another evaluation point is that, first of all, you can criticise Milgram's original experiment for a lack of population validity because it only contained middle-aged men as the sample. So there was no women in it. So as an evaluation point, you can criticise that research methodology and say, well, there's a lack of population validity. However, if you want to extend that point, you can say that the Milgram experiment has been replicated many times, and Blass in 1999 studied 9 other replications of the obedience experiment that included male and female subjects, and all of them, with one exception, found no male or female differences. So although the original experiment is criticised for a lack of population validity, when they've replicated the experiment with women as well, men and women will obey in exactly the same way. Apparently women will complain more about obeying, but they will still have exactly the same as the men. The last evaluation point is important, but remember, for AS you only need 3 evaluation points, and ethics is definitely one you should mention because it's really important. For A2, you will need 5 evaluation points, and you might want to mention about the Josephine massacre, because this evaluation point is important because Milgram, remember, the reason that he did his research in the first place was to understand why the Nazis had performed such terrible acts in Nazi Germany. So, for example, whose job was it to turn on the gas in the gas chambers? Now, when I go to work and I teach people stuff, and hopefully they learn things and they do exams and that's it. But imagine if my job was to go to work and murder people. And Milgram said, well, why did they do it? Why would you do that as your job? And so he did this experiment to try and understand why the Nazis had done such terrible things. So this evaluation point is criticising Milgram and saying, don't use your experiment to excuse the atrocities that happened in Nazi Germany. And Mandel in 1998 used the Josephine massacre as a criticism of Milgram. So Mandel says that the original experiment lacks external validity, and that means you can't apply the results to the real world, and therefore you can't excuse what the Nazis did to millions of Jewish people and others. So the Josephine massacre, you can read about it in your textbooks, but the Police Battalion 101 in Nazi Germany had a task where they had to march like hundreds of Jewish men a long way, and then at the end of it they would kill them and bury their bodies in a mass grave that you can see there. So really awful. But they were told beforehand that they didn't have to do it. So nobody was encouraging them, no one was telling them they had to do anything, but they still did it. So in the Milgram experiment, the experimenter said you must continue, it's required that you continue. In the Josephine massacre, nobody was giving them instructions to do it, but they still did it. Also, if you think about Milgram's variation on proximity, the idea that the closer you are to the person that you're inflicting pain on, the less likely you are to obey. That's what he found. But in the Josephine massacre, that wasn't what was found. The Police Battalion 101 marched arm to arm with the Jewish people that they were causing so much pain to, and killed them at point blank range. And so you can use that to show that Milgram's variation of proximity lacks external validity as well. It doesn't make sense. You know, if Milgram says, oh, well, you're not going to obey if you're in close proximity to someone, well, in the Josephine massacre, they did. And so if you are interested in this point, if you've got an interest in history or anything, then look into this one and use this as a really good evaluation point to say this, you know, you don't use Milgram's experiment as an alibi for what happened at the Josephine massacre. If you really want another evaluation point, here is one, but you don't need another one. But just in case, Milgram's original experiment was criticised for a lack of ecological validity, which meant that the setting wasn't true to life, and so therefore we question whether you get the same results in the real world. But Hofling did an experiment in 1966 that showed obedience in a real live situation. So what happened was, it was 1966 and there was a sample of 22 real nurses in a hospital, and they were all qualified, and they knew that they were not to take instructions over the phone from anybody, and they also could read, and they knew that they could only give medication that was prescribed on the bottle, how much medication they could give. So Hofling did an experiment where a supposed doctor, who was a figure of legitimate authority, rang the hospital and spoke to the nurse, and he did this 22 times because he spoke to 22 different nurses. And he told them over the phone to get some medication and give it to a patient, and he told them to give them 200 milligrams of a drug when actually the maximum dosage was 20 milligrams, which was written on the bottle. And they wanted to see whether the nurses would obey the doctor because of the hierarchy and because of legitimate authority. So how many nurses do you think obeyed the doctor, even though they knew they were meant to take messages over the phone, and even though they were told to give 200, even though the bottle said 20? What do you reckon? Out of 22. So the answer is 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed. So this is a really fantastic evaluation point to back up Milgram's original research. So it starts off by saying, although Milgram's research was criticised for a lack of external validity because it was performed in a fake environment in Yale University, Hofling did a field experiment in the real world and showed that 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed a legitimate authority figure despite there being consequences for what they were doing. So they might have killed the patient with the medication, or they might have lost their job by taking orders over the phone. Okay, so I'm going to put the directed study on MS Teams, but there's there'll be those questions there. And the final question is an AO2 exam style question. So the AO2 question is where you're given a scenario and then you apply your knowledge to answer the question. So you don't have to explain the theory, you just apply the knowledge. And if you want to, then this is a kind of structure for the 12 marker. And that's the end. Thank you.